Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another video on the heels of our high-risk severe weather event yesterday across parts of Kansas and Oklahoma that thankfully did not end up as anticipated. There were a few significant tornado reports, especially from the Barnsdall and Bartlesville, Oklahoma area after dark, but for the most part, the storms behaved themselves. Had a couple of other isolated tornado reports, but overall, it was definitely an underperforming event, and that I don't think anyone is complaining about, including myself. Always excited on those days about from a storm chasing perspective, but as a resident of these areas under the gun, it definitely puts a pit in the stomach. So thankful that that event yesterday did not pan out as expected, but our severe weather event is going to continue into today and tomorrow, especially across parts of the Midwest. The SPC has outlined for today, Tuesday, May 7th, a level 3 out of 5 enhanced risk for parts of Indiana, Ohio, and down into Kentucky. Slight risk surrounds that, and a marginal risk extends down into parts of Texas and off to the eastern seaboard. So a very broad area of severe threat today, but the most intense threat is focused there on parts of the Midwest. All hazards on the table for today, including the threat for tornadoes, some of which could be strong, particularly in the 10% hatched, the yellow stippled region here across Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky, with the 2 and 5% areas surrounding that. Then we have a large hail, perhaps very large hail risk in that 15% hatched area, as well as damaging winds. So all hazards on the table for today. And then we move into tomorrow, where we have a very broad enhanced risk level 3 out of 5 from basically the Ohio River Valley southwestward into the ArkLaTex region. Very large enhanced risk with a broad slight risk and marginal risks surrounding that. The threat for all hazards is again on the table for tomorrow, perhaps in a significant fashion. Tornado threat is at a 10% hatched for now from basically southwest Missouri, the Springfield area eastward into Kentucky and Tennessee, including places like Bowling Green, Nashville, Evansville, St. Louis, under the gun for that 10% hatched risk tomorrow, with a 5% extending out down to the southwest into the ArkLaTex region and southeast Oklahoma. So broad tornado risk tomorrow. Could be a couple of strong tornadoes, particularly in that yellow stippled region there. And then we also have a large to very large hail risk, 30% hashed area extending from the ArkLaTex northeastward into the Midwest and Mid-South. So large to very large hail possible tomorrow, as well as damaging winds. So multi-day all hazards threat on the table for tomorrow, today and tomorrow. So we're going to get into those couple of days in this video. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Let's take a look at our upper air maps here on the SPC Mesoanalysis page. This is the 500 millibar map, as we always start off with. Big old trough here, closed trough centered across the Dakotas. Broad belt of stronger flow rounding the base of this trough with a little bit of a shortwave embedded in the flow right now across Kansas and Missouri. This shortwave going to continue to eject off to the east or northeast today, and that will provide the main impetus for severe storms, particularly in that enhanced risk region, allowing for a little bit better forcing for ascent and severe weather ingredients in that area out ahead of that shortwave. This is a very broad trough, and we're going to have multiple shortwaves rotating through the flow. You can see a little one back there across the Pacific Northwest, perhaps. A few ripples there across the Rockies into the Southern Plains, and our main shortwave out here across Kansas and Missouri as we speak. So these shortwaves going to rotate through the flow, and we're going to see another one develop as we go into tomorrow and eject off into the Midwest to provide that severe threat for tomorrow's risk on Wednesday. As such, because we've had strong flow traversing the Rockies for a couple of days now, we've had a significant low-level response. Very strong surface low here, centered across the northern plains. 982 millibar low, as estimated by the SPC Mesoanalysis page. So a very strong, very tightly wound low has begun to occlude. So if we were to draw in our fronts here, our cold front would probably be back here somewhere like this through the pressure tongue, and our warm front would be kind of in the same spot here, something like this perhaps. So that portion here where the two meet, that's going to be our occluded front, where the cold front has overtaken the warm front. So our low has certainly started to occlude here, but we do have plenty of warm sector still out ahead of this cold front and south of the warm front. Warm front going to maintain itself somewhere in this vicinity here, perhaps lift north just a tad while the cold front shifts off to the east today, and that should be our main initiating boundary for our most potent severe weather setup, so a round of severe weather for today's setup. We'll have probably additional surface low development going into tomorrow for tomorrow's event as well, but we'll take a look at the models in just a second. Going up to 850 millibars, we've had a strong low-level jet in place through the night as we had kind of that strong tornado in northeast Oklahoma, fueled very much by the increase in the low-level jet. But going to be a pretty good case study as to why we did not see significant tornadic activity across a wider area yesterday, particularly across Kansas and Oklahoma, as that low-level jet ramped up after dark. So that's going to be good fodder for a case study here down the road. But that low-level jet has maintained itself and will continue to maintain itself throughout the day as this cyclone kind of sits here. Strong 30 to 40, 45 knots of flow here from the Gulf Coast states northward into the Great Lakes in Canada. So a broad swath of low-level jet helping to increase the low-level shear for today's setup. Going off to our surface data here, let me refresh things here. So you can see where our boundaries are on this particular map. This is our raw surface data at its most recent time. Clear wind shift across parts of Illinois into Iowa. You can see more southwesterly flow here across Iowa, westerly flow almost across western Missouri, shifting to southeasterly flow here across parts of eastern Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, and eastward. So probably a warm frontal zone somewhere in this vicinity here. A little bit tough to pinpoint exactly where that might be, but probably somewhere in here. This could be influenced by morning convection. We did have a little bit of a round of morning convection. Our warm front might actually be up in here. We see a little bit better temperature gradient, 50s up here to the north, 60s down to the south. So a little bit of a chaotic wind field here. We did have some thunderstorms that continue here this morning across eastern Illinois into western Indiana. Some isolated severe reports in that. So that may have messed up the wind field a little bit. But our warm front probably drapes somewhere in here again, and it's going to perhaps lift just a tad northward as we go into the day today before that cold front sweeps through off to the east. But a very robust low-level air mass here. Dew points in the 60s, low to mid-60s across a wide region from Indiana into Illinois, back down to the south across Missouri. Upper 60s dew points down here the farther south and southwest you go, even some 70s dew points there across Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas into the Gulf Coast states. Those will be slowly making their way northward today. So we should have fairly rich moisture ahead of these boundaries. Going to some soundings now. Let's take a look at our Nashville sounding from this morning. This is going to be in the warm sector, that is going to be making its way northward into the region. 65 over 64 at the surface. We do have plenty of elevated instability at this point. Wind profiles leave a little bit to be desired, but this is a little bit farther removed from the overall shortwave here. So if we were to take a sounding from up to the north, we should see a more substantial wind profile. Here is Lincoln, Illinois, and you can see that a little bit. Even though our thermodynamics here are pretty wonky, very saturated profile, likely some rain and clouds ongoing at the time that this sounding was released. Here we are up at Davenport, not much difference. Southwest Ohio, Wilmington, Ohio. Tough to get a good picture here this morning as far as what our environment is going to be like later on today. Springfield, maybe not a bad analog here for the upcoming wind profile that's going to be making its way across the Midwest. Quite a bit of curvature there in the low levels of the hodograph thanks to that stronger low-level jet that is veered a little bit out of the southwest. But lengthy hodographs here, 50 plus knots of bulk shear, some curvature there in the low levels. That should be advecting its way northward ahead of those boundaries as that shortwave trough makes its way off to the east or northeast. And that should allow for deep layer shear to strengthen across the Midwest out ahead downstream of the Springfield area here. Some model data for today. Let's go ahead and take a look at our 12Z NAM starting at 500 millibars. Here's our little shortwave that is embedded within the flow here, a little bit of a jet streak associated with that shortwave. Moving off to the northeast, and you can see the kind of kink in the flow there. By midday, 18Z, 1 p.m. Central Time, our jet streak located across Missouri into Illinois. Shifting off to the northeast, rounding this closed circulation here aloft. But this should provide a nice belt of stronger flow aloft for the strengthening of the deep layer shear going into the afternoon that could support supercells, especially near any of those surface boundaries. Now let's go down to the surface. We'll see how the surface pattern responds today. So that surface low going to be well off to the northwest, going to continue to occlude and just kind of meander there across the northern plains, not really doing much throughout the day. Here we are at 4 p.m. Central Time, our surface low well up here into North Dakota. Warm front or occluded front / warm front down in here, probably somewhere lifting just north going through the afternoon, somewhere across northern Illinois, northern Indiana, northern Ohio. Cold front down here to the south going to be pushing off to the east. This is going to be a very occluded cyclone. Lots of this warm front will have been overtaken by the cold front, so a very occluded cyclone. But the cold front should be our initiating boundary. Somewhat veered flow out here ahead of the cold front. And let me actually put on the moisture here so we can better see the frontal boundaries. So you can see that that air mass is going to be advecting northward as we go through the day today, that rich moisture to the south, going to be advecting northward through the Midwest and into these regions. So you can kind of see where our boundaries are. Surface low up here in North Dakota, occluded front stretching all the way down here into the Great Lakes, warm frontal zone right across here, northern Indiana, northern Ohio, and our cold front probably back in this region here. So still a broad warm sector out ahead of these boundaries. But it is going to be pinched off, and that warm front, this low will continue to occlude significantly and probably just become cut off here and just die over the next day or so. But still plenty of moisture out here ahead of these boundaries, ahead of the cold front especially. Cold front should be our initiating boundary here today. Going to be somewhat quick moving, so as always, that kind of raises some eyebrows as far as storm mode goes. But not super quick moving. It's not going to be all that progressive. So our initiating boundary going to be that cold front. We'll kind of draw it in here so we can look at our storm mode. So here's your wind shift right in here. It's a little bit tough to tell exactly. Again, this is a very complex surface pattern here, but probably somewhere in there, I would guess, with our moisture maybe somewhere back in here. But nonetheless, this is going to be our cold frontal boundary. So our storm mode, if we were to put on our shear vectors, does look pretty favorable here for maybe some batch of discrete convection there going into the warm sector south of the warm front. But it is a little bit difficult since we'll have multiple kind of forcing mechanisms today at play. The warm frontal zone, we should have a focus for convection along the warm front, and then again here down along the cold front. So probably going to have a lot of convection today, maybe a little bit of a stretch to say we're going to have purely discrete storms, but should have some semi-discrete supercells, probably a mixed mode type event here, with some clustered linear segments as well as some semi-discrete supercells. And those semi-discrete supercells, of course, will have the greatest threat for that significant severe weather, we were talking about earlier. So let's go ahead and take some soundings here out across this region. We'll take one here, kind of central Indiana by about 4 p.m., just getting into that enhanced risk. And you can see here why we're looking at a significant severe threat. So we have plenty of instability, 2,500 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE. Decent amount of curvature there in the low levels of the hodograph, so plenty of curvature there for that tornado threat. Deep layer shear favorable for supercells in excess of 60 knots there, effective bulk shear, so plenty of shear for supercells and organized severe storms. 80 over 68 there at the surface, so a very juicy low-level environment, fairly deep moisture as well, up above 850 millibars. So all in all, looking like a fairly favorable parameter space for all severe hazards. And with some of that curvature, some of that veering and strengthening of the winds with height and low-level hodograph curvature should support that tornado risk going into the afternoon hours. Let's go to 0Z here and kind of take a sounding out ahead from the kind of Indiana-Ohio border region. We'll see how that environment evolves through the afternoon. We see winds here on the NAM at least try to veer a little bit at the surface with time, so we have a little bit of a more wonky hodograph, but still favorable for all severe hazards. This is not all that uncommon in this part of the U.S. to get this more veered low-level flow. As long as we still have quite a bit of curvature here in the low levels of hodograph and veering and strengthening of the winds with height, we should have a maintaining of the tornado threat going into the early evening hours tonight, before things eventually probably congeal into a line as the cold front pushes off to the east and we get a lot of convection to fire near the core of that strengthening low-level jet. But plenty of instability, plenty of deep layer and low-level shear to support that all-hazards threat, and so we should see that tornado threat materialize with any more semi-discrete supercells, especially going into the afternoon and evening today. Here is some of our high-resolution model data. So here was that early band of storms on the HER, moves off to the east and dissipates through the morning. And then we get kind of additional redevelopment out here across Illinois into Indiana, closer to that warm frontal zone as it lifts off to the north. So anything that interacts with the warm front could have that slightly enhanced tornado risk with a little bit stronger low-level shear along the front. But you can see there some stronger supercells along the front, some scattered convection down to the south in the open warm sector ahead of the cold front. And we see kind of just a mixed mode environment. A mix of supercells, some clusters, some linear segments in there. So it looks to be somewhat of a mixed mode event, and then we should see kind of a congealing of this convection into some clusters here going into the overnight hours tomorrow. And then we'll have to, and then we're going to have to go into tomorrow morning and see how things progress through the morning. Probably going to have some convection around here as we move into the morning hours tomorrow, down here across perhaps Tennessee, Kentucky, and then our main round going to come. And a pretty complex severe threat is expected to take place tomorrow across these regions. So let's go ahead and take a look at tomorrow here. Just to remind you, once again, broad enhanced risk from the ArkLaTex northeastward into the Ohio River Valley and mid-south. So let's go ahead and back out to our NAM. We'll take a look at our CONUS sector here. And so let's go ahead and start this evening. The trough, this shortwave kind of ejects off to the east and kind of dissipates a little bit going into the northeast. And then we get this secondary shortwave to develop here across the Central Plains into the Midwest. So here we are at 7 p.m. tomorrow. You can see a little bit of a kink in the flow there with a little bit of an associated jet streak. So a little bit of a belt of stronger flow associated with this shortwave moving through. And that should be our main impetus on the synoptic scale for severe weather tomorrow. Going down to the surface, let's back it up to 0Z tonight. So here we go. We get that surface low, our original surface low off to the north to continue to occlude. We start to see a little bit more, a little bit stronger cyclogenesis here once again down in the central to southern high plains. And as a result, we get a little bit of stronger surface low development moving east through the day tomorrow into the Midwest. And that should be helpful in bolstering the severe threat tomorrow out ahead of it. So there's your surface low right there across Missouri at about 1 p.m. Central Daylight Time, suspecting that we might see a little bit of early initiation to these storms tomorrow. We saw that on the HRRR model, our convection allowing model, just a couple minutes ago. But the surface low already has progressed into central Missouri by 18Z, 1 p.m. And as you recall, our enhanced risk extended all the way down into the ArkLaTex here. So the fact that our surface low is somewhere in here by 1 p.m. suggests that we might see a little bit of a progressive nature to this setup and an early initiation of storms in this regime. So we'll take a look at our moisture here to couple that with our surface low surface pattern. So our moisture is still a broad area of warm sector to deal with going into the tonight, into tomorrow. Broad area of 70s dew points to work with for the storms tonight and into tomorrow. We'll see those 70s dew points once again advect their way northward ahead of the surface low going into tomorrow. Let's zoom in just a little bit here. So there's your warm front at 18Z, 1 p.m. Cold front back in here across Kansas and Oklahoma with your surface low somewhere in this vicinity right in here. So plenty of warm sector, broad, lots of real estate for these storms to work with. But again, probably an early initiation of storms. The NAM, you can definitely see in the lifted index fields here some wonkiness there, probably indicative of some convection. So early initiation of convection is likely tomorrow, and we'll probably have multiple rounds of severe storms as the warm front lifts north and the surface low progresses off to the east. So let's take a couple of soundings. Again, broad warm sector here to work with. We'll take one at 18Z right along just south of the warm frontal zone, and that's going to be our main focus for any significant tornado threat tomorrow. Going to be right along this warm frontal zone where low-level shear is enhanced. Down here to the south, not quite as strong low-level shear to work with, but still strong deep layer shear for supercells. Well, let's take a sounding here, 1 p.m. along the warm front. And you can see by midday that we already have a fairly favorable environment for all severe hazards. Ample instability over 4,000 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE, 85 over 72 there at the surface with fairly deep moisture. So all in all, a very unstable profile with stronger deep layer shear for supercells, bulk shear in excess of 70 knots ahead of that very compact but intense shortwave. So very long photographs and strong low-level shear as well. Effective storm relative helicity in excess of 200 meters squared per second squared, strengthening and veering of those low-level winds with height. So that should foster that all hazards threat, probably in, again, a multi-round type of setup where we'll have that initial convection ahead of the surface low in the morning, probably along this line here moving into Missouri. That could foster that damaging wind, some large hail with any more isolated updrafts, and perhaps a tornado threat early on. Farther to the south here early on, let me go to our southern plains sector here. And so we'll take a sounding here, it's probably just southeast Oklahoma ahead of the cold front. Again, this is at 1 p.m. Central Daylight Time tomorrow. So you can see here we're already destabilized pretty fully by 1 p.m. across southeast Oklahoma. Ample instability once again, 4,100 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE. Strong deep layer shear for supercells. Not a lot of low-level shear to speak of, so this would foster more of a large hail and damaging wind risk with any storms that fire along the cold front down here to the south. Going into the afternoon, again, we're going to have to watch how convection behaves and progresses through the afternoon to see where the best rounds of severe weather, most intense rounds of severe weather will set up. But again, that warm frontal zone looks to be a focus, but there could be a lot of convection along that warm frontal zone. Here are our boundaries. Cold front, warm front right in here. And so let's take a look at our shear vectors with respect to the initiating boundary. So along the cold front, enough perpendicularity to support maybe a few discrete supercells. Along here, though, our shear vectors are very much parallel to the frontal zone, and even perhaps a little bit crossing the frontal zone here, which may have a tendency for storms to cross that front and become elevated with time. We'll have to watch that for sure. Any storms, of course, that can maintain themselves in the warm sector and along and south of the warm front will have that all hazards threat, but anything that crosses the front will have more of a large hail threat as it will become elevated north of the front. But plenty of instability south of the front, but a lot of convection here that will probably train along the warm front. And so we should see a fairly messy mode, I would suspect, tomorrow. Lots of clusters, lots of line segments here, especially near that warm frontal zone. But any more discrete updrafts will have that threat of producing a few tornadoes, perhaps one or two strong. Down along the cold front, not all that progressive of a cold front, it looks like. Let me go back to our southern plains sector here. I'll put on our moisture so we can see it a little bit better. But not all that progressive of a cold front. It's really going to just kind of surge down to the south with this intrusion of some colder, drier air from the north, and that will foster that severe threat for Thursday. There is a slight risk out for Thursday as that front sags down into Texas. Very rich moisture here along the Gulf Coast to support a severe threat on Thursday. But going into the afternoon on Wednesday, not all that progressive of a front, so we should have plenty of time for these storms, perhaps a few more discrete storms down here across southeast Oklahoma into the ArkLaTex, Arkansas region, with your main risk up here to the north along the warm front for any really significant tornadic activity. But again, I think that may be tempered a little bit by storm mode. A couple soundings here at 0Z just to take a look at how the environment progresses through the afternoon and evening. So here we are up in the Midwest. This is a favorable sounding for all severe hazards. Lots of instability once again. Somewhat unidirectional flow there in the lowest kilometer or two of the atmosphere, but still enough curvature to support a tornado threat there. Effective storm relative felicity in excess nearly 300 meters squared per second squared. So that would be favorable for maybe a tornado threat there, but not seeing a super favorable environment for really significant tornadoes, perhaps, given somewhat unidirectional flow there in the lowest levels of the atmosphere. Let's take a look down to the southwest into southeast Oklahoma. Much more of a large hail and damaging wind threat here with ample instability, nearly 5,000 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE. 85 over 76 at the surface. Very juicy air in the low levels, but your low level shear leaves a lot to be desired there. Limited curvature, but strong deep layer shear for supercells. So with perhaps a more discrete mode down to the southwest into Arkansas, Oklahoma, southeast Oklahoma, and northeast Texas, that could foster more of a large to giant hail threat there with any more discrete supercells. So not looking to be all that of a significant event. I've seen a lot of people discussing whether this should be upgraded to a moderate risk or whatnot. I'm a little bit skeptical at this point, just looking at the model data and how we may have a somewhat of a messy convective mode, especially near that warm frontal zone going into the day on Wednesday. But we'll have to see. We certainly could see an upgrade there as profiles would support perhaps strong tornadoes with large instability and some larger low-level shear, especially up here to the north across the Midwest. But down here to the south, certainly more of a large hail and damaging wind risk as opposed to a tornado risk. Once again, we'll go back to our cams here. This is the 12Z HER. Again, take these with a grain of salt. More than a few hours out, these just do not do a good job. We'll have convection ongoing through the morning across Tennessee into Kentucky. But you can see early on we get this line of storms to form very early on across eastern Kansas, northeast Oklahoma into Missouri. Quick formation into a line of storms here that will probably be our first round of severe weather if this comes to fruition. And then you see a lot of storms coming up here along that warm frontal zone out ahead. But overall, just a very messy convective mode here. You can see a lot of clusters, a lot of line segments here. We do seem to get additional development behind this initial round. Again, we're going to have to watch how that initial round plays out, as that could have some significant impacts on the environment later on going into the afternoon. The HER seems to think it's not going to be too much of an issue. Very quick redevelopment here behind the morning round. I'm always a little bit skeptical of that, but if this can develop here, some more discrete supercells up here along the warm frontal zone, perhaps along any convective outflow, if the atmosphere recovers enough, we could see that strong tornado threat and all hazards threat materialize. Down here to the south along the frontal zone, Fairly robust updraft development there. Some more discrete supercells down to the south across northeast Texas into southeast Oklahoma, western Arkansas. Again, the farther southwest you go, more of a large hail and damaging wind risk, with your tornado risk focused up here along the warm frontal zone with any more discrete supercells. But overall, kind of a messy convective evolution tomorrow. I don't think there's enough confidence to warrant a risk upgrade at this point. We'll see what the SPC does at 11:30. I'm recording this at about 10 a.m. Central Time today, so we'll have to see how that goes. But overall, it looks like a fairly messy convective evolution tomorrow, with multiple rounds of severe storms possible, posing that all hazards risk, especially with northward extent toward that warm frontal zone. So that's going to do it for this video today. Once again, we're going to continue our severe weather outbreak sequence today across parts of the Midwest, Indiana and Ohio, down into Kentucky. A threat for a few tornadoes, perhaps a strong tornado if we can get some more discrete supercells there, with a threat for large to very large hail. And then we go into tomorrow as well, broad enhanced risk from the ArkLaTex region northeastward into the Midwest and Mid-South, up from Tennessee, Kentucky, westward down into the ArkLaTex region. Broad enhanced risk, multiple rounds of convection tomorrow in a complex scenario. Again, we could see that initial round of storms here moving across the Midwest. We'll have to see how that does as far as what it does to our environment for later on. But if we can get redevelopment behind the morning round, that could pose that all-hazard threat, particularly up here to the north along the warm frontal zone and any convective outflow. Down here to the south, more of a large hail and damaging wind risk with some tornado risk evident along that cold front going into the eastern Oklahoma, ArkLaTex, western Arkansas region. So that's going to do it for this video. I might be back tomorrow morning with an update video if the setup warrants, as it does look to be a pretty potent setup. But again, we've outlined kind of the potential flies in the ointment with tomorrow's setup as far as being a risk upgrade. But certainly could see that still being on the table. So we'll have to see how that goes. But for the folks in these risk areas today and tomorrow, definitely stay safe, have multiple ways of receiving warnings, and you'll get through these severe weather setups just fine. So with that, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.